President Trump versus Elon Musk, new China threats, and the White House tell-all book nobody asked for. All of that and more today on 10-Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Wednesday marked the deadline for other countries to begin submitting their best final offers to President Trump and the Trump administration for trade deals ahead of the July 8th end of the 90-day pause.
According to reports, President Trump is demanding U.S. trading partners submit their best offers.
We're watching closely countries like India. The European Union has talked about fast-tracking their negotiations, but one country we are specifically focused on is China. In the last few weeks, there's been a lot of back and forth, and this week, President Trump is slated to talk to Xi Jinping about our China trade deals and a number of other issues related to China trade. One issue of particular focus for the Trump administration and everybody else is the issue of biopharmaceuticals. In the last few years, China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in developing their own biopharmaceutical industry, hoping to take on America's leading role in that, focusing specifically on cures. For example, just this week, a China-based biopharmaceutical company announced major strides in the effort to cure cancer, focused specifically on multiple myeloma. Now, it's positive for anyone to be working towards finding a cure for cancer, but the large blinking red lights around this development are the fact that the people who developed the coronavirus pandemic and unleashed it on the world now are taking a larger and larger share of the biopharmaceutical industry that American patients are going to have to rely on as America kneecaps our own biopharmaceutical industries with policies like President Trump's most favored nation price controls over drugs that are going to drive down American investment in cures and innovations and drive up China's ownership of that market. There's also major national security concerns. Just this week, Chinese nationals were caught attempting to smuggle in what's been called an agroweapon, fungus.
A chilling announcement from the Justice Department. Prosecutors charging 2 Chinese nationals here at the University of Michigan with smuggling a dangerous fungus that's potentially a bioweapon.
Well, the FBI says this is a reminder of how the Chinese government is looking to target American vulnerabilities.
So again, as you hear about the people that unleashed the coronavirus pandemic that killed millions of people, that have unleashed fentanyl, that again killed millions of Americans and continues to kill people every day, the people that are now developing agroweapon funguses that could kill billions of U.S. crops but also infect Americans and kill many more. Do you want that country and those people in charge of such a large part of the biopharmaceutical industry that we are going to rely on for basic medicines if we continue to narrow and kneecap our own biopharmaceutical industry with things like price controls that take away the incentive for American companies to develop drugs that they won't make any money off of while China is subsidizing hundreds of billions of dollars in their industry? A major, major issue to continue to track. On Tuesday, Elon Musk launched a major broadside against President Trump's big, beautiful bill. Now, these dynamics are interesting because Elon just left the White House literally last week and is already teeing off on this bill, which is right now the most important part of President Trump's agenda, in part because it contains the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, which, if not extended, would be a cataclysmic event for the U.S. economy. But the White House is also pushing back on the substance of Elon's claims. One of the White House's points of contention with Elon's attacks on the bill is Elon relying on the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO's projections of how much this will add to the deficit. The White House argues that this will cut $1.6 trillion from the deficit with a number of cuts to major important things that we're going to get into. But they also push back on Elon using the CBO's projections that don't take into account the growth that can come from tax cuts. A lot of conservatives and just general free market Americans don't believe that tax cuts are considered adding to the deficit because that basically suggests that our tax dollars are already owned by the government, and letting us keep more of our own money is taking money from the government, which I think is an absurd proposition. The other major distinction that the White House is pushing back on is the fact that this is not a spending bill. This is not a normal budgetary bill. A reconciliation bill has a very different focus with very different rules about what you can accomplish with it. And so while Republicans are planning on codifying a number of the DOGE cuts and making other massive cuts to spending, what they can achieve with this bill is much more limited by the rules and by the structure of this this process. So if you are a limited government conservative, somebody who wants to see major cuts to spending, getting behind what Republicans are doing right now, particularly with cuts to waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid, is the most valuable horse to get behind right now. Back in 2017, when Republicans passed the first version of the Trump tax cuts and had a focus on healthcare and a number of other major priorities, the way that Democrats attacked that effort was things like wheeling in healthcare patients to say, you're taking away our care, you're taking away millions and millions of people's care. This time, they're trying to do a lot of that same thing. But one thing that the Trump administration and Republicans have really effectively pushed back on is who is going to lose their Medicaid and what actually constitutes a cut. A lot of the media is talking about taking away Medicaid from someone who should not be on Medicaid as a cut. For example, the media defines taking Medicaid from an illegal immigrant as a cut. They define taking away Medicaid from an able-bodied person who should not be on Medicaid as a cut. But also things like taking away the Medicaid enrollments in multiple states for one person as a cut. For example, the Wall Street Journal found state and federal governments have paid $4.3 billion for people who are enrolled in Medicaid in multiple states. Audits have revealed individuals being enrolled in as many as 9 states for Medicaid at once. And when you remove those duplicative enrollments, so if one person's enrolled in 9 states and it goes down to 1, they consider that as 8 people losing their Medicaid. Without reforms, Medicaid is on track to dole out more than $2 trillion in improper payments in the next decade. $2 trillion is more than the annual GDP of South Korea. And that is how much money in improper payments, waste, fraud, and abuse that's projected to go out over the next decade without some of these really, really important reforms. And that comes from the FGA, the Foundation for Government Accountability. So these cuts are absolutely necessary. And again, you cannot say you support Medicaid if you're not willing to make the program work better and longer by getting rid of this massive amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse. But the other key component to that is the work requirement issue. As you hear media describe work requirements, they talk about it as a draconian, red tape-filled problem for people. But again, as you go through what they're describing as red tape and obstacles, these are things people overwhelmingly support and think are responsible. For example, the work requirement is 80 hours a month of work, and that includes work, looking for work, or simply volunteering. 80 hours a month, which comes down to 20 hours a week. You have to be able to certify it twice a year, in some cases, twice a month. States have to actually track these things. States have to be able to document and audit who's getting Medicaid and how much they're spending for it. Media treats that as a negative thing. Normal people who want to see cuts to waste, fraud, and abuse in the program work better think it's weird that states aren't already doing that. But that is a big reason why we have the massive amounts of improper payments that we already have. But again, as you talk about this red tape and the fact that members of the media are talking about how it's too burdensome for people to have a work requirement, what's the alternative to having that? Giving out Medicaid to everybody without any kind of check at all. And this is much easier to understand when you remember that the Democrat goal here is government-controlled single-payer healthcare for everyone. That's why they don't want work requirements. That's why they don't want any checks or balances on the program, because their goal is to get as many people on Medicaid as possible and control the system that way. On Wednesday, the House Oversight Committee's subcommittee on DOGE, cutting fraud, waste, and abuse in government spending, held a hearing on NGOs Gone Wild. NGOs are non-government organizations, and NGOs Gone Wild focuses on the massive amount of grant making that the Biden administration did, giving taxpayer dollars to left-wing political groups. One of the key focuses from that hearing was on climate spending. We've talked extensively here about how Biden officials have described the taxpayer dollars going to climate groups as throwing gold bars off the Titanic. One key focus of that climate spending was discussed by witness Scott Walter of the Capital Research Center, who talked about an organization called the Environmental Law Institute, who have taken taxpayer dollars from grants from EPA and other government departments to then create a curriculum where their goal was to train judges who were hearing cases about how energy companies had created climate change.
They get most of their money from government, not citizens. Second, they serve the big government political agenda that fights to centralize power in Washington for the benefit of the left's preferred political party.
When you follow the money there, it's easy to understand why Democrats hate DOGE and efforts to cut fraud, waste, and abuse in government so much. When you understand this configuration, the fact that Democrats created these grant programs to go to these NGOs like the Environmental Law Institute so they can train judges to find against energy companies to kill fossil fuels, but also to extract hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties from these energy companies to then cycle back into other Democrat political activities, it's easy to understand why it's so important that Republicans continue to focus on rooting out that fraud, waste, and abuse and finding all of these very, very nefarious schemes where our tax dollars have gone to fund political activities that will hurt us in the long run. We've talked in our last few episodes about the Democrats' $20 million effort to study the syntax of how men speak to try and overcome their massive, massive polling problems. Politico had a story today that those findings are out. One thing that people have found interesting is the fact that this group was led by the former president of NARAL, which is the National Abortion Rights Action League, John Della Volpe, a longtime Democrat pollster who specializes in Gen Z voters, and former Texas Rep Colin Allred, who unsuccessfully ran for Senate last year. So the three people leading this effort are one of the largest abortion rights leaders in America is going to help Democrats figure out how to talk to men. John Della Volpe, the Democrat pollster who's been telling them for the last several years that they're doing great, driving them off into the ditch. And then Colin Allred, who lost his Senate race to Ted Cruz because he focused too much on things like abortion and allowing men in women's sports. But here's my favorite quote from this story. A Latino man from Las Vegas said that during the 2024 campaign, Harris focused on, oh, I got Beyonce on stage with me. Oh, I got Lady Gaga on stage. And it just kind of felt like, what does this have to do with me? I'm trying to move up in life. Trump's over here like, if we're able to get a surplus on our budget, then we're going to have no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. It's going to take a while to get to that point, but at least he's saying the things that, oh, this is what I'm going to do, the Latino man added. So while this report does show that Democrats are figuring out the depths to which men don't trust them, they also are continuing to dance around the fact that there's no messaging answer to this. Tucked away at the very end of that Politico story was one Democrat operative who said, we can't message our way out of this, which again, they didn't need to spend $20 million to find out the fact that people simply don't agree with Democrat ideas and priorities, particularly after they spent the last 4 years remaking the entire economy to focus on climate change and trying to get men in women's sports. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, Biden White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre has the White House tell-all book that nobody asked for.
In an era of misinformation, disinformation, the regressiveness of social policy, what we're seeing currently right now, what I have decided to do, and I really have thought long and hard about this, is to follow my own compass.
In material previewing this book, this is what they wrote. KJP presents clear arguments and provocative evidence as an insider about the importance of dismantling the torrent of disinformation and misinformation. Now, as you read that, again, this is one of the most outrageous things I've ever read in my entire political life. But remember how Karine Jean-Pierre was the face of the Biden administration's campaign to defraud the country about his health. For example, here's what she said about the word cheap fakes.
Let's step back for a second. Instead of, and I said this moments ago, instead of Republicans, focusing on the president's performance in office and what he's been able to accomplish, his actual record, they do these cheap fakes. They're cheap fakes.
Now, a reminder, cheap fakes is the word that the Biden administration used to try and dismiss any video that showed Joe Biden having senior moments. Cheap fakes was their word to cover it up and say, this has been manipulated. That's not really Joe Biden having a senior moment. So in the debate, when he had senior moments exactly like what people had seen in those videos the administration dismissed, people were shocked. And it was because of Karine Jean-Pierre. But the other major part of her book is she talks about leaving the Democrat Party after they betrayed Joe Biden by calling on him to drop out. There are some outrageous questions that are going to be raised by this book that I hope members of the media who participate in this book sale tour will ask, because at the same time, she's likely going to be answering similar questions when she gets hauled in front of Congress to talk about her role in this cover-up. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on 10 Minute Drill. Please subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, tell your friends. Thanks so much. Have a great day.